Abstract. In this chapter, I survey the football fandom ecosystem in Egypt. I first describe the media environment around the sport and chart out the geographic structure of fan support for teams in the Egyptian Premier League. I then examine how fandom intersects with politics, both as Egyptian leaders have sought to use support around Egyptian football to build legitimacy, but also how Egyptian football fans have often been a significant political force acting independently of the ruling regime. I argue that different groups in Egypt have sought to use the intense interest in Egyptian football to pursue external goals, a dynamic that sometimes generates conflict when these goals are at odds. I conclude by outlining the social organization of football fandom. I illustrate how the most committed fans are young single men living in urban areas and who are more engaged in religion than the average citizen, after which I describe the role of women and the Coptic Christian minority in Egyptian football. Introduction. Some scientists have argued that sports teams can be analyzed as if they were integrated superorganisms, where individuals develop cooperative relationships in order to obtain successful group performance against competitors. While this analogy provides a compelling explanation for the behavior of the 11 athletes on the pitch, football fandom is a different creature in a country such as Egypt, where the fascination with football is at least as dominant as anywhere else in the world. In this context, football fandom is more akin to an ecosystem in which new species can enter, and where existing ones compete for a niche amid competition and environmental changes. In this chapter, I examine the dynamics of this football fandom ecosystem in Egypt, highlight some of the key actors, and illustrate how these actors have sought to pursue their goals, sometimes in collaboration with and sometimes at the cost of competing agents in this dynamic space. A theme running throughout this chapter is how, because of the time, money, and emotions invested in football by Egyptians, goal-oriented groups across the country, even those unrelated to the game, often attempt to use the sport as a vehicle through which to advance their objectives. High-level overview of football fandom in Egypt. By available metrics, interest among Egyptians in football is as high as anywhere in the world. This interest takes the form of actual participation in football. 50% of all Egyptians reported playing football within the past month when surveyed in 2018. This number is second only to Nigeria at 65%. Interest in football also takes the form of fandom, as 88% of Egyptians stated that football was one of their favorite sports to watch on TV, highest globally. Egypt's current fondness for football has deep historical roots. Participation in football grew rapidly after the British introduced football to Egypt following their formal colonization of the country in 1882. Children and young Egyptians may have been among the first to develop an interest in the newly introduced game. In 1890, the Egyptian newspaper Al-Ahram printed a poem warning parents of the intense passion for the English game that had begun to manifest in young people. By 1921, the skill of Egyptian footballers had progressed to the point where an Egyptian team beat both British military and civilian teams for the first time in King's Cup, a feat which a British official in Egypt stated was the result of student exposure to football in schools. The skill of Egyptian footballers was further developed as Egyptians exposed to football came together to create the first formal teams in the early 1900s, less than 30 years into British colonial rule. These teams would later go on to form the backbone of the two-tiered Egyptian Football League system. The top tier, known as the Egyptian Premier League, is not unlike that of other leagues such as the English Premier League, where a few teams like Manchester United and Liverpool have achieved much more success than other clubs in the league. However, the disproportionate success of a few squads is even more pronounced in the Egyptian Premier League. Indeed, out of 61 Premier League seasons between its founding in 1948 and 2020, a single team, Al Ahly, based in Cairo and founded in 1909, has won 42.69% of all league championships and has been a finalist in 53.87% of seasons. The next most successful team, Zamalek, also based in Cairo and founded in 1911, has won 12.20% championships. The third most successful team is Ismaili Sporting Club, champion in 3 seasons. No other team among the roughly 20% in the league have won more than a single league championship. This bimodal pattern of success is mirrored in a strikingly bimodal structure of fan support, where Al Ahly and Zamalek are by far the most popular clubs throughout Egypt, with only a small handful of rival clubs showing even sizable regional support. One way to characterize the relative popularity of different football clubs in the Egyptian Premier League is to analyze data on search volume in the Egyptian market. Teams with a higher search volume will generally have a more extensive following as fans search for updates about their team. Throughout Egypt, data from 2019 to 2020 show that 2 teams carry a large fraction of overall interest in the country together, amassing 89% of all search volume among searches for the most popular 6 Premier League teams. Between Zamalek and Al Ahly's fan base support is likely larger. Throughout all 27 governorates of Egypt, search volume consistently shows that Al Ahly was the most popular club in Egypt. With about 50% of total search volume, followed by Zamalek at 38%, and then Ismaili between 2% and 4%. There's a sharp cutoff in search volume for the other clubs, although the situation may change as new clubs enter and gain success in the Premier League, such as the Pyramids Football Club. Because of the dominant interest in Ali and Zamalek, the Cairo Derby, a critical match held between the teams, is a central fixture of the Egyptian football season, and is watched by more than half of the entire population. Despite Al Ahly's and Zamalek's overall predominance, there is a strong regional component to fandom for several other teams in the Egyptian Premier League. For example, Ismaili has a strong regional following in Ismailia Governorate, containing the city of Ismailia on the Suez Canal. There, Ismaili garners about 40% of search volume, compared to 32% and 25% for Al Ahly and Zamalek respectively. Likewise, search volume for Al Masri stands at about 29% in the Port Said Governorate, compared to 31% and 35% for Al Ahly and Zamalek respectively. Al Ittihad Alexandria Club also has a more pronounced following in Alexandria itself. However, this search volume is more muted than in Ismailia for Ismaili, and in Port Said for Al Masri, reaching only 4%. Despite these pockets of regional interest in other clubs, these figures only highlight the overall predominance of support for Al Ahly or Zamalek, each of which receives higher search volume than any other team in all governorates except Ismaili and Ismailia. Although it is somewhat surprising that Al Ahly and Zamalek surpass the popularity of regional clubs throughout Egypt, it is not surprising that there is general support for the Egyptian national team as it competes on the world stage. Drawing from the talent developed through the Under-20 Youth and Premier League, the Egyptian national team has won the African Cup Championship 7 times, more than any other nation. Relative to its success in Africa, it has somewhat underperformed in the World Cup, qualifying 3 times compared to Nigeria's 6. But the team was the first African squad to make it to the World Cup finals in 1932. Since 1992, the Egyptian national team has had an average FIFA ranking of 34, with its best ranking of 9 coming in 2010. Disruptions in the play of football following the 2011 Egyptian Revolution caused the team's ranking to fall to 60th in 2014. Although their performance improved following the rise of Egyptian footballer Mohamed Salah as one of the top footballers globally. Indeed, Salah's goal from an injury-time penalty kick famously secured the team's qualification in the 2018 World Cup and led to enormous outbursts of joy in spontaneous parades through the streets of Cairo and other cities. The high level of interest in football is simultaneously caused by and contributes to the extent to which football pervades the Egyptian media environment. Television is a dominant way in which Egyptians have traditionally consumed football-related media. Recall that 88% of all Egyptians reported football matches as among their favorite content. Yet, digital media consumption has grown rapidly. As of about 1 million Egyptians of the population have regular access to the internet, 1 million Egyptians had Facebook accounts, and football content features heavily in these digital spaces. In 2018, the Cairo Derby between Zamalek and Ali was streamed on Twitter for the first time. 4 of the top 10 most searched for individuals were associated with the Egyptian Premier League. Direct engagement of Egyptians with the social media profiles of top footballers is also common, with Egyptian stars such as Mohamed Salah becoming the most popular Egyptian on Instagram with over 43 million followers. Because of Egyptians' frequent engagement with media around football, Premier League sponsorships are highly prized by companies seeking to build brand awareness. For instance, Egypt's Presentation Sports Company paid in 2018 about $31 million to acquire a 4-year sponsorship of Al Ahly SC. Fans of Zamalek and Ali teams, especially their ultra groups of organized and hardcore fans, which we will examine in more detail later, have been particularly sophisticated creators of fan content online. For instance, Zamalek's Ultras White Knight UWK affiliates made available computer backgrounds and screensavers that interested people could download. UWK members also wrote a song about the 22 Zamalek fans who died at the Air Defense Stadium disaster, a piece which has garnered almost 1 million YouTube views. There is also a Spotify account associated with the UWK name with 41,000 subscribers. Although ultra groups are currently banned in Egypt, and the social media operation of many groups, such as Ali's Ultras Alawi, has largely ceased, social media presence of some groups are still active. For example, a UWK Twitter account having 64,000 followers posts updates about court proceedings involving UWK members, and more football-related encouragements to the Zamalek squad. Fandom and politics, from top down to bottom up. Because of the high interest among Egyptians in football, it is no surprise that fandom can sometimes become intertwined with politics, as football becomes a tool for activism and persuasion. This involvement has sometimes been directed by Egyptian leaders, and at other times been more influenced by private citizens outside of governmental control. Ever since Egypt was released as a formal protectorate of Britain in 1922, Egyptian leaders have sought to use football as a way to gain support and build national identity. For example, King Fahd was involved in the sponsorship of early clubs, such as Al Ahly, so that Al Ahly's first stadium was renamed in the 1920s to Prince Farouk Stadium. The Egyptian Soccer Cup was also known as the Prince Farouk Cup between 1922 and 1942. State patronage of football continued after the monarchy was overthrown by Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1952. For example, Nasser's Minister for Social Affairs was present to inaugurate Al Masri Club Stadium, formerly known as Port Said Stadium, in 1955. Nasser himself attended the first Cairo derby match between Al Ahly and Zamalek during the 5-5 season, and Cairo International Stadium, the largest stadium in Egypt when built, was initially called Nasser Stadium. During the Mubarak era, football fandom was also used as a vehicle for building or maintaining popularity. According to one analyst, the Mubarak regime sought to craft Gamal's image as a man of the people through his support for Egyptian football. For example, the U.S. diplomatic mission reported that Gamal Mubarak, son of Hosni Mubarak, made a point during a public health conference to emphasize his Egyptian pride after Egypt's World Cup qualifier loss to Algeria. He explained that, following the match, he refused to leave the country until able to accompany the national soccer team to the airport and ensure they left Sudan safely. Only then did he depart to return to Egypt. He called support for the national team critical. Egyptian leaders have also sometimes intervened in football club decision-making to advance Egyptian nationalism, for example. When President Sisi urged the Pharaohs FC to hire an Egyptian manager, fan interest in football has reportedly been manipulated by the Mubarak regime in vote-buying schemes, with diplomatic cables reporting that the ruling National Democratic Party offered football tickets to Egyptians in order to secure their votes as recently as 2007. Football, however, has not merely been a tool for elites to maintain or build support, but has also been a venue for bottom-up political mobilization. For example, when the Ismaili team visited Aden in contemporary Yemen for the matches in 1963, local crowds, according to British officials, showed enthusiasm for the visiting Egyptian crew. They twice gathered at the hotel where the Egyptian team was staying, where at least one member of the Ismaili team went to the crowd, leading pro-Nasser slogans and criticizing the Aden police who had previously dispersed the group. This example illustrates not only how Egyptian football was seen as an ideological gathering point for the ideas of pro-Arab unity in the 1960s, but also how the Egyptian footballers sometimes directly participated in political activism. This bottom-up mobilization has also long carried a nationalistic dimension as well. For instance, it is hard to miss a sense of national pride in the 1947 archival footage showing members of the Egyptian military cheer and members of the Egyptian public dancing for joy after an Egyptian team scores in football match against a British team played in the Alamein Club, which was built for the British military by the Egyptian government to show appreciation for Britain's defense of Egypt against Germany's Afrika Korps in the Second World War. Likewise, a fray between Egyptian and Algerian fans following a World Cup qualification match led to a diplomatic crisis between the two countries, causing hundreds of Egyptians to later gather in intense demonstrations around the Algerian embassy. More recently, as the ruling National Democratic Party tightened its political monopoly during the Mubarak era, football fandom was also one of the few ways in which citizens could forge independent organizations outside of either state repression or state co-option. For example, around 2007, Egyptian young people, primarily young men in urban areas such as Cairo, began creating football fan groups that showed an increasingly great degree of organizational sophistication. These groups, called ultras and inspired by similar groups in Europe, would create slogans, orchestrate pyrotechnics, distribute posters and organize elaborate in-game displays, sometimes called typhos, involving thousands of people in the stands. Ultra groups also lead chants, some of which express frustration against the Egyptian security forces, and a sense of determination to persevere despite police action against the groups. The in-game displays are impressive organizational feats, as they involve coordinated action of thousands of people spread throughout the stadium. Figure Refig Stadium shows one such display put on by Ultras Aloy in 2014 in support of Al Ahly. As has been increasingly discussed in the academic literature and dramatized in two documentary films called Ultras and Ultras of Egypt, these ultra groups played an important role in the 2011 Egyptian Revolution. Because the Ultras had experience dealing with Egyptian security forces before and after matches, they had developed the know-how to remain focused and organized during the street battles of 2011. Moreover, because these groups had not been as heavily repressed as more overtly political organizations such as competing political parties, they had an organizational structure that, supported through telephone and internet communication, could bring out thousands of ultras-led protesters at key moments during the 2011 revolution. The language and concepts of football also infused some of the protests. For instance, during the 2011 movement, some groups of protesters would carry physical replicas of the red cards given to footballers following serious on-field misconduct, implying that the Mubarak regime and security forces were out of line. The experience of ultra groups in the post-revolutionary period has been marked by tragedy. While the ultras played a key role in the Egyptian revolution of 2011, their public exposure expanded rapidly after an incident in February 2012 at Al Masry Club Stadium, then called Port Said Stadium. There, 74 people, many of whom were members of Ultras Al-Ali, were killed and hundreds injured following what has been characterized as a large riot. Some observers noted that police failed to open critical gates in the stadium, effectively trapping Ali supporters, and 9 police officers were among the 73 people who received charges related to the disaster. The true causality underlying the chaotic night will likely stay somewhat opaque, but some in Egypt speculated about a systematic role of the state in the worst of the violence as a reprisal against the ultras. For instance, an aide to the U.S. Secretary of State reported that intelligence assets in the Egyptian military believed that Egypt's General Intelligence Directorate had engineered the rioting through agents in the crowd, with the overall goal of creating a sense of chaos in the country and delaying the transition to civilian rule by extending the state of emergency in Egypt. Regardless of the veracity of these particular claims, the fact that some Egyptians raised questions about the possibility that the events were in part fueled by state hostility towards the ultra groups can help illustrate how some Egyptians perceived these hardcore football fan groups as being engaged in a conflict against government actors, including the security forces. The 2012 Port Said disaster was a harbinger of difficulties to come for ultra fan groups in the post-revolutionary period. After a 2-year hiatus in the Egyptian Premier League, instituted after the Port Said disaster came to an end, football resumed in the country. Another disaster took place almost immediately, this time at the Air Defense Stadium in February 2015, as 22 Zamalek fans were killed during a rush of people towards a barbed wire-topped gateway following the release of tear gas by police. Moreover, state repression against ultra fan groups also may have become more focused in the years following the 2012 disaster, especially as the new military regime, led by Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, gained confidence and recognized the political threat posed by the ultra groups. For example, at the 3rd anniversary of the Air Defense Stadium disaster, a lawyer for the Association for the Freedom of Thought and Expression reported that 18 UWK members were detained by the police, with the UWK Facebook page stating that they have not been charged with a single crime. Ultra members have been arrested on other occasions as well, often being charged with crimes related to breaching protest laws, bullying, and threats of violence. Many of these arrests came after the Egyptian government issued a formal ban on ultra groups in 2015, a designation which justified more aggressive police action. The Egyptian government also sought to depoliticize Egyptian fandom by, for example, requiring that fans provide their personal details, such as their home address, to security forces in order to gain admission to matches, a move which served as a deterrent against attendance for fans who had been more active against the regime. These attempts to depoliticize football fandom in Egypt through intimidation or direct police action seem to have successfully reduced the public footprint of groups such as the Ultras. Indeed, in mid-May of 2018, both the Ultras Ahlawi and UWK announced their formal dissolution on their respective Facebook pages, with both announcements containing revealing statements about how the groups have been in support of the state since its establishment, in the case of Ultras Ahlawi, and completely out of respect of the law, in the case of the UWK. Ultras Green Eagles, supporting Al Masry, announced their dissolution in July 2018. Figure 1 summarizes some of these trends about the Ultras' public exposure by examining all news articles mentioning Ultra groups published in the Egyptian Independent between 2007 and 2021. There is a clear spike in stories about the Ultras following the Port Said incident, and a second smaller spike following the Air Defense Stadium incident. After the formal dissolution of some of the key Ultras groups in May and June of 2018, there have been few mentions of Ultra groups in the Egyptian Independent, indicating that a genuine decline in their activity has indeed taken place. As of 2021, it appears that the political dynamics of fandom may be returning to their pre-2007 state, where football fans may skirmish with security forces after matches, but do not present themselves as more cohesive agents acting for political change on the streets of Cairo. Figure 2 illustrates some of the dynamics around the ultra groups by summarizing the topic content of the Egyptian Independent corpus. We obtain the topic content of each article after fitting a latent Dirichlet allocation LDA model with 10 topics to the corpus, following lemmatization and the removal of stop words. We generate topic labels after analyzing the highest probability words associated with each topic. We can examine temporal trends in the discourse around the ultra groups by looking at the running average of the topic. Proportions over time, which provides a simple summary of how the average word use patterns have evolved during the rise and eventual fall of the ultra groups. We find a spike in the discussion of political organization and police clashes in the period of revolutionary activity in early 2011 and into 2012. After 2012, there is growing attention paid in this corpus to the legal defense of ultras members, in addition to a general discussion of football, as ultra groups are formally banned in May 2015. After entering the political scene by being under the radar, and not subject to the same publicity in the news media as other more overtly political groups, ultra groups faced growing police opposition and endured a series of disasters that has seemingly led to their depoliticization and dissolution in the post-revolutionary period. The sociology of fandom in Egypt. But who are these most fervent of Egypt's football fans? Some of the best information about football fandom comes from the World Values Survey, a large-scale survey source containing information on the beliefs and community life of Egyptians. In this survey, randomly sampled Egyptians were asked about whether they belonged to voluntary organizations involving sports. Given the dominant role of football in the Egyptian sports scene, we can use this information to provide indirect evidence about the social dynamics of fandom in Egypt. In the most recent wave of this survey carried out between 2017 and 2020, we found that about 5% of those surveyed stated that they were members of at least one voluntary organization involving sports, which, in Egypt, would predominantly involve football. Men were much more likely to be involved in such organizations, making up 88% of those involved, as were those in urban areas, 61% in urban versus 44% in rural areas. The average age of members skewed young relative to the average age of those surveyed, 32 versus 40 years old. Participants in these sports organizations were also much more likely to report being single or never married, 56%, compared to the average among those surveyed, 16%. Interestingly, members of these sports-centered organizations were also much more likely to report attending religious services at least once a month, 89% versus 57%. Overall, this survey data suggests that Egyptians in sports-related organizations tend to be young, single men who are also somewhat more invested in religion compared to the average Egyptian. Although the most engaged sports fans tend to be, on average, more religious than the average Egyptian, there are other ways in which fandom in Egypt has been intertwined with religion. For example, after the 2012 Port Said disaster, some ultras used terms such as martyr to describe the dead. In response, a conservative Salafi spokesperson stated that the victims were in no way martyrs, as they died for entertainment associated with a sport that was imported from the West. That distracts people from God, and that is not explicitly allowed in Islam. Moreover, in the run-up to the 2014 World Cup in Brazil, a number of Salafi clerics in Egypt issued fatwas, or Islamic legal opinions, against the watching of football matches, again referring to the futility of all sports except archery and the training of horses. These strict Salafist views do not seem to sway public opinion around football in Egypt. As noted, more frequent participants of religious activities are, in fact, moreover, 88% of all Egyptians view watching football games as one of their favorite shows to watch on TV, and about 87% of all Egyptians are Sunni Muslims. As a consequence, at minimum, 86% of all Sunni Muslims must view watching football as one of their favorite sources of entertainment. Furthermore, not all Salafist groups have struck such an antagonistic posture towards football. For example, Salafist TV presenters such as Hazem Shoman have used professional football as a metaphorical landscape for talking about scoring in the pursuit of religious piety. In this way, the relationship between football fandom and Islam in Egypt is subject to contestation, with some Islamic groups using football as a metaphorical framework to connect with Egyptians and others taking a more oppositional stance. It is also important to describe the role of women and minorities around football in Egypt. Although women do make up a significant share of those who watch football on TV, we have seen that men make up the majority of the membership in sports-based civil society organizations such as ultra groups. Moreover, as more media attention is generally given to men's soccer globally, the disparity is also pronounced in Egypt, especially as the Egyptian women's team has not achieved the same degree of success in matches. While the men's Egyptian national team has qualified for 3 World Cup appearances, no women's team has qualified for the Women's World Cup. There are some signs of interest on part of the Egyptian Football Association, EFA, in addressing the relative disparities in resources or opportunities for female footballers. For example, Sahar Abdelhak, an EFA board member, helped secure a $500,000 grant from the FIFA Forward program for bolstering women's football in Egypt, in part by creating women's counterparts to leading Premier League teams. Yet, no one was tasked specifically with focusing on the development of women's football after Abdelhak's term on the board expired. In summary, despite some investments, public demand for and business investment in women's football at the professional level remain relatively low at the moment. There has also been debate in Egypt about the extent to which there is discrimination within the football community around the Coptic Christian minority. It has been noted that, although Copts make up about 10% of the population, there were few, perhaps one, Copts working in the Premier League as players or coaches. The most prominent Coptic Christian to succeed in the Egyptian Premier League was Hani Ramzi, who played for Al Ahly and the Egyptian national team from 1987 to 1990 and 1988 to 2003, respectively. Ramsey recalls or suggests that the disparity between the Coptic population size and their representation in the football community is due in part to a fear that Coptic youths might be rejected from youth teams due to their religion. This fear then prevents parents from encouraging their children to seek out membership in leagues. There are also other reports of more direct discrimination against Copts interested in joining youth teams. To address this possibility of exclusion, the Coptic community organizes football competitions for Coptic youth teams. The Jisui Football Academy for Copts was also recently founded in Alexandria, catering to Coptic football talent. By studying the role of women and the Coptic minority in Egypt, we get a sense of how, despite the nearly universal interest in football in Egypt, opportunities and resources for playing football at the professional level are most readily available to men and members of the dominant Sunni religion. Conclusion. Football is the world's most popular sport, and perhaps nowhere is football a more central part of society than in Egypt. This chapter has provided a general introduction to the ecosystem of football fandom in the country by describing the main fan factions, examining the media environment around football, and exploring how football fandom is connected to other parts of society, including politics. We have seen that, because of its important role in the lives of Egyptians, different actors seek to use football fandom in pursuit of their distinct goal. The state may seek to direct football fandom towards feelings of Egyptian nationalism or towards the support of the ruling regime. Business leaders may attempt to tie club interest with brand awareness. Religious leaders may engage with Egyptians' love of football while describing spiritual ideas. Citizens may fall back on relationships forged while watching football matches in conflicts with security forces. These disparate forms of engagement all hinge on the one thing that has remained constant in this narrative: the intensity of interest and emotions around the beautiful game.